There is a 128-page pamphlet in the Special Collections Research Center at the University of Chicago. It was published in 1895. It is called The Red Record. It is the first statistical report on lynching ever compiled in American history. Nobody assigned it. Nobody funded it. One woman wrote it alone and almost died before it could be printed. In 1890, 11 million of America's 12 million families earned an average of $380 a year. That same year, one party in New York spent $65,000 on champagne. This is the era your history textbook called the birth of the American dream. Now, before I go any further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Drop it in the comments. When you think of the most important era in American history, which one comes to mind first? Because I have a suspicion most people skip right over the one that matters most. You were probably taught American history in a sequence that goes something like this: Revolution, Civil War, World Wars, Civil Rights, Moon Landing. Maybe the Great Depression gets a mention. Maybe the Founding Fathers get 3 full chapters. But somewhere between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the start of the 20th century, there is a stretch of about 30 years that most textbooks treat as connective tissue, a bridge between the dramatic and the modern. A few sentences about railroads, a paragraph about robber barons, and then we move on. That period has a name. Mark Twain gave it one in 1873 in a novel he wrote as a piece of social satire. He called it the Gilded Age, not the Golden Age, gilded, as in a thin coat of gold applied to something far less valuable underneath. I came across the full significance of this era while I was researching something else entirely, the origins of the modern American tax system. And what I found underneath that gilding has not left me since. Here is what I kept coming back to. The Gilded Age is the era that built the country you are living in right now. The railroads, the skyscrapers, the corporate monopolies, the concept of the American dream itself, all of it crystallized between 1870 and 1900. This is where modern America was assembled. And yet the people who lived through it are almost completely absent from the story we tell ourselves. Let me give you the raw numbers, because the numbers matter here. By 1890, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned 51% of all national wealth. Not a third, not a quarter, more than half. The top 12% owned 86% combined. And on the other side of that equation, the bottom 44% of the entire country, nearly half the population, owned 1.2%. That same year, 1890, 11 million of the nation's 12 million families earned less than $1,200 per year. The average annual income for that group was $380. Workers were putting in roughly 60 hours a week for that number. 60 hours. And the phrase being used in the working class press, not by radicals, not by anarchists, but by ordinary workers in ordinary newspapers, was wage slavery. This is the foundation on which someone threw a party where the favors were cigars wrapped in $100 bills. Now I want to introduce you to someone, because without her, we would know almost nothing about what this era actually looked like from the bottom. Her name was Ida Bell Wells. She was born into slavery on July 16, 1862, in Holly Springs, Mississippi, during the Civil War. She was emancipated as an infant when Union troops captured her town. By age 16, both of her parents and her infant brother were dead, killed by a yellow fever epidemic in 1878. She became the sole provider for 5 younger siblings. She lied about her age to get a teaching job, moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and by 1889 had become part owner of a newspaper called the Memphis Free Speech. On the morning of March 9, 1892, Ida Wells learned that 3 of her friends had been murdered the night before. Their names were Thomas Moss, Henry Stewart, and Calvin McDowell. They owned a grocery store, the People's Grocery, and they had made the mistake of being too successful. Their business was drawing customers away from a white-owned competitor. A white mob came for them. They were dragged from their jail cells, taken a mile outside Memphis, and killed. Ida Wells began investigating. What she found was not an isolated incident. She traveled across the South, interviewed witnesses, studied records, and documented case after case. She published her findings in the Free Speech. She named names. She cited specific facts. She argued, with data, that the official justification for lynching, the claim that black men were being killed to protect white women from assault, was, in the documented majority of cases, a deliberate lie used to suppress economic and political competition. The response was immediate. While Wells was traveling in New York, a white mob burned her newspaper office to the ground. A note was left behind saying she would be killed if she returned to Memphis. She never went back. Here is where the story gets strange in a way that I have spent considerable time thinking about. The popular telling of this era, and you have probably heard some version of it, goes like this. The Gilded Age was when America's robber barons got too powerful, the public got angry, and the progressive era came along to clean it all up. Teddy Roosevelt busted the trusts, laws got passed, and democracy corrected itself. A messy but ultimately functional system working as intended. I spent weeks checking this version against the primary sources. It collapses almost immediately. Here is the part that popular history consistently leaves out. While all of that industrial reform was being celebrated, a separate and parallel system was being built in the American South that had nothing to do with progress. Between 1877, when federal troops withdrew from the former Confederacy, and 1900, Black Americans were being stripped of the voting rights they had been granted after the Civil War through a systematic combination of literacy tests, poll taxes, targeted violence, and legal manipulation. And underneath all of that, documented by Ida B. Wells in the 1895 publication The Red Record, which is sitting right now in an archive at the University of Chicago, there were 235 documented lynchings in a single year. 1892. 235. Wells combed through 14 pages of detailed statistical data covering the years 1892 to 1895. She had sourced everything from white press bureaus and white newspapers, not from sympathetic sources. And what she found was that in more than 2/3 of documented cases, the victims had not been accused of the crime most commonly cited as justification. They had been killed for registering to vote, for running businesses that were too profitable, for being in the wrong place, for refusing to defer. The official narrative says lynching was extrajudicial mob behavior that the government eventually addressed. The documented record says the government watched it happen for decades and passed nothing. Not one federal anti-lynching bill cleared both houses of Congress during Ida B. Wells's entire lifetime. She died in 1931. In 1873, Mark Twain publishes a novel satirizing the corruption and shallow spectacle of this new wealthy class. The satire is widely read. Nothing changes. In 1877, Reconstruction ends. Federal troops leave the South. The protections that had briefly allowed Black Americans to vote, hold office, and build businesses are quietly dismantled state by state. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law to bar immigration based on race, while simultaneously importing 700,000 Eastern European immigrants per year to work in steel mills and coal mines at wages the native-born workforce refused. In 1886, economist Henry George publishes Progress and Poverty, a bestseller, arguing that the concentration of wealth under industrial capitalism will eventually destroy the republic from within. The book sells millions of copies. Nothing changes. In 1890, Jacob Riis publishes How the Other Half Lives, documenting the tenement conditions in New York City with photographs. 2/3 of New York's population at this moment is living in documented, substandard housing. The book shocks the public, modestly changes. In 1892, the year 235 people are documented as lynched, Alva Vanderbilt throws a masquerade ball in her Fifth Avenue mansion. The party costs $250,000 in 1892 dollars. $65,000 is spent on champagne alone. In 1893, the United States hosts the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 27 million visitors attend. The fairgrounds are called the White City. Ida B. Wells and Frederick Douglass produce and distribute a pamphlet at the entrance, documenting how Black Americans have been systematically excluded from participating in the celebration. In 1895, the Red Record is published. The government's response is silence. In 1896, the Supreme Court rules in Plessy v. Ferguson. Racial segregation is now constitutional. In 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, a white mob stages what historians now call the only successful coup d'etat in American history, overthrowing a legitimately elected biracial local government by force. The federal government does not intervene. By 1900, the wealthiest 4,000 families in the United States hold roughly the same amount of wealth as 11.6 million families combined. Each of these events can be explained individually. Together, they describe a system. I want to be honest about something that troubled me while I was researching this. The framing most often applied to the Gilded Age, that it was simply a natural phase of capitalism that democracy eventually corrected, requires you to ignore the people for whom no correction ever came. The Progressive Era did produce real reforms: the Sherman Antitrust Act, the beginnings of food safety regulation, early labor protections. These are real. I am not dismissing them. But the Progressive Era also produced a president, Woodrow Wilson, who resegregated the federal workforce in 1913, reversing integration that had been in place since the Civil War. The same reform moment that broke up Standard Oil also watched Jim Crow laws spread unchallenged. These two things were simultaneous. And the reason American history does not hold them in the same frame is not because the evidence is complicated. It is because the story is more comfortable without it. Archives don't forget. There is a house at 3624 South Martin Luther King Drive in Chicago. It is a private residence. It was listed as a National Historic Landmark on May 30th, 1974. It is where Ida B. Wells lived after she left Memphis and never returned. She brought her anti-lynching campaign to the White House in 1898. President McKinley forwarded her petition to a Senate committee. The committee deliberated. No law was passed. She did this again with the next administration, and the one after that. She helped found the NAACP in 1909. She was later written out of the founding story by colleagues who found her too uncompromising. It wasn't until 2020, 89 years after her death, that Ida B. Wells was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for her journalism. If you want to understand why the Gilded Age matters, it is not because of the robber barons. It is because the pattern established in those 30 years, the idea that economic progress and documented injustice can exist simultaneously without contradiction, and that only one of those things will be remembered as history, did not end in 1900. The Red Record is still in that archive at the University of Chicago. You can request to see it. The pages are 130 years old. The names in the margins are real. And the question I keep sitting with is this. Ida B. Wells was in New York when they burned her press down. She was not inside. If she had been at her desk that morning, the documented evidence she had gathered, the names, the dates, the cases, the data she had verified from white press sources so no one could call it biased, all of it burns with her. The archive survives because of an accident of geography. How much didn't survive? If this kind of buried history, the documented record that mainstream education quietly skipped over, is something you want to keep exploring, subscribe and stay in this channel. There is more where this came from, and the next one goes even deeper.